The northern Alberta sky was a canvas of crisp blue on April 24, 1980, reflecting off the serene surface of Slave Lake. In this town, nestled amongst whispering pines and vast forests, an innocence prevailed. Doors were left unlocked, children's laughter echoed freely, and neighbors knew each other by name. It was a place where danger felt like a distant rumor, a shadow that fell on other maps. On that deceptively tranquil afternoon, Denise McKay, a spirited 32-year-old, tended to laundry in her modest backyard. Her 3-year-old son, Jeffrey Dupres, a bright spark with sun-kissed chestnut hair and a small scar on his chin, a memento of a childhood tumble, was immersed in the joyful labor of pedaling his prized red tricycle. It was a Christmas gift, still gleaming, a vessel for races with his next-door friend, Rodney. Around 1 p.m., a simple request. "Mom, can I go see Rodney?" Denise, occupied with the mundane rhythm of washing and drying, granted permission. From her kitchen window, a mere 50 meters separated their homes, a distance easily spanned by the boys' tricycles. She worked to the comforting symphony of their chatter, the whir of tiny wheels and bursts of laughter, sounds that spoke of a world yet untouched by shadows. A few minutes later, Rodney's father's voice cut through the air, calling his son home. Denise glanced out, but saw neither child. Assuming Jeffrey had simply followed his friend inside, she continued her tasks. 20 minutes bled into an eternity. Then a knock. Rodney stood alone, a puzzled frown on his face. "Can Jeffrey come out to play?" A sudden, Arctic chill seized Denise's stomach. She bolted outside, her calls for Jeffrey echoing against the sudden, profound silence. She scoured the small yard, the edges of the road, the neighbor's shed. There, near the curb, lay the red tricycle, abandoned, one wheel spinning a slow, desolate arc. No footprints led away, no cries had pierced the afternoon. Nothing made sense. At 1:45 p.m., a frantic call to the police. The voice on the other end was dispassionate, citing short staffing, suggesting she search with friends before they dispatched a car. Denise obeyed, her voice growing hoarse, her desperate pleas for Jeffrey's name tearing through the quiet streets. An hour later, her composure shattered. She called again. By the time the first officers arrived, nearly 2 hours had vanished since Jeffrey was last seen. The initial search was swift, focused on the immediate vicinity: ditches, alleys, the nearby woods. Denise, through a haze of fear, described Jeffrey's clothes: a blue t-shirt, red shorts, and plastic sandals adorned with cartoon faces. The officers dutifully noted the details, scrawling "possible abduction" in their report, a chilling phrase that, for now, remained merely ink on paper. As the late afternoon bled into evening, news of the vanishing child spread like wildfire. A small army of volunteers materialized. Men left their shops, teachers guided students to join the hunt. The local fire chief meticulously organized search grids, lines of people moving shoulder to shoulder across fields, their voices shouting Jeffrey's name into the gathering wind. The search continued through the night, flashlights carving paths through the trees, the distant scent of forest fires adding a surreal weight to the air. Dawn brought fresh faces, over 200 volunteers strong. Every home, every shed, every patch of earth was meticulously re-examined. Nothing. When the first night's search finally ended, Denise refused to leave. She sat in a neighbor's kitchen, eyes fixed on the door, listening for a sound that never came. Her husband, Ray, had rushed back from a business trip, joining the search until exhaustion claimed him, only to rejoin the teams after an hour's restless sleep. Words were scarce between them, too insignificant to hold the enormity of their new reality. In the stark hours of April 25th, the RCMP officially filed a missing person report. But investigators quickly sensed something far more sinister than a child simply wandering off. No trail, no dropped toy, no sign of an accident. The disappearance was too abrupt, too clean. Someone, or something, had plucked Jeffrey from his familiar world in the blink of an eye. That morning, the first fragile thread of a lead emerged. A woman living 3 houses down recalled a small pickup truck parked near the street around the time Jeffrey vanished. Inside, a man and a woman. The man, in his 30s, fair-haired and clean-shaven. The woman, younger, mid-20s, with shoulder-length brown hair. They seemed unremarkable, ordinary. The witness believed she saw the woman lean from the passenger window, calling to the child, but the words were lost to the wind. Then, the truck was gone.
Pressed for details, the woman faltered. The color of the truck? Perhaps light blue, perhaps gray. It boasted shiny chrome bumpers and a short bed, a GMC or Chevrolet from the late 70s, she thought. The license plate was a blur. She had simply assumed it was a neighbor's visitor. This singular, fragmented testimony would become the linchpin of a baffling investigation. The sole solid lead in a case destined to span decades. But on that spring afternoon, it was merely one more piece in a shattered mosaic. A mother's scream, a fallen tricycle, a town's shattered illusion of safety. By nightfall, Slave Lake was irrevocably changed. The familiar houses stood, the pines still whispered, but the comforting cloak of security had evaporated. Open windows were now shuttered. Parents clutched their children close. The red tricycle, once a symbol of carefree joy, was brought inside, cleaned, and placed in a quiet corner of the living room. Denise gazed at it, not as a memory, but as a silent, chilling piece of evidence, the last tangible trace of her son in a world that had suddenly become vast and menacingly silent. From that day forward, Jeffrey Dupres was never seen again. As the sun climbed on April 25, 1980, the search for Jeffrey Dupres entered its agonizing second day. Slave Lake's Main Street, usually bustling, was hushed, its shops closed, the only movement a convoy of police vehicles and volunteer trucks laden with supplies. Word of the missing child had reached the provincial RCMP, dispatching additional officers and a helicopter. The town's recreation hall was transformed into a command center. Folding tables groaned on maps, thermos flasks, and rudimentary sketches of the area. Denise and Ray Dupres, adrift in a sea of despair, sat at one end, surrounded by friends and neighbors offering what solace they could. Denise, sleep-deprived, clung to a fragile hope. A call, a voice confirming Jeffrey had been found, weary but unharmed. That hope would not survive the day. By mid-morning, the RCMP officially reclassified the disappearance as a likely abduction. Sergeant Alan Creighton, a seasoned investigator with 2 decades of experience, meticulously re-examined the initial witness statement. The description of the truck and its occupants painted a picture of premeditation, not chance. This was a rare, chilling crime for a quiet Canadian town. A child taken in bold daylight, within sight of home, without a single sound of struggle.
Search teams were redeployed. The woods north of the Dupres home were painstakingly combed again, this time with police dogs. Air support meticulously scanned the lakeshore and connecting roads. Officers halted every vehicle leaving town, scrutinizing the faces of children within. None matched Jeffrey's description. By afternoon, over 300 volunteers had joined the swelling ranks. High school students walked shoulder to shoulder along the community's perimeter, their young voices calling Jeffrey's name into the unforgiving air. The local radio station broadcast hourly updates, imploring listeners to check their sheds, garages, and backyards. With each passing hour, the belief that Jeffrey had simply wandered off eroded further. As evening descended and temperatures dropped, the command center received the official transcript of the witness interview. The details remained scarce but consistent. A small, late 70s pickup, possibly custom-painted, occupied by two individuals, one man, one woman. The woman, it was noted, had leaned towards the child, perhaps coaxing him. Then the truck sped away, tires spitting gravel. Sergeant Creighton underscored the statement with a red pen. It was the first solid piece of information suggesting an abduction, not an accident. But a good lead, he knew, was not the same as evidence. Without a license plate or corroborating witness, the description could apply to hundreds of vehicles across the province. On the third day, the search fanned out to surrounding highways. Officers systematically checked rest stops, motels, and campgrounds. Truck drivers were questioned, asked to recall anything unusual they might have seen. A few remembered a light-colored pickup heading south that afternoon, but none could definitively identify its occupants. By the fourth day, the story had breached national news. Television crews descended upon the small police station, reporters dubbing it the Slave Lake Mystery. Jeffrey's photograph, a bright-eyed boy on his red tricycle, became the poignant face of the investigation, plastered on posters across Alberta. For the Dupres family, the sudden deluge of attention brought a cruel mix of support and suspicion. Denise noted the sharpened edge of reporters' questions. "When was the last time you saw him alive?" one asked with unsettling bluntness. "Do you think he might have run away?" another probed, as if a 3-year-old could orchestrate such a flight. She realized with a crushing weight that even in the throes of tragedy, a mother's actions were subjected to impossible scrutiny. In the ensuing week, officers interviewed every neighbor on the street. Most offered the same disheartening refrain: "A quiet afternoon. Nothing unusual." One elderly man recalled a vehicle accelerating abruptly, but its direction remained elusive. Another resident vaguely remembered a woman standing near the road earlier that morning, but dismissed her then as a mere passerby. On the 10th day, with no fresh evidence emerging, a new, insidious theory began to take root, turning inward. Some investigators, pressured by their superiors, started to entertain the agonizing possibility of a domestic matter. Such suspicions, though cruel, were not uncommon in child cases when leads ran dry. Denise and Ray were interviewed separately, their accounts meticulously scrutinized for inconsistencies. Denise answered every question with quiet fortitude until the insidious suggestion of her own involvement. The words froze her. She declared she had nothing to hide, inviting them to test her. Within hours, she was driven to Edmonton for a polygraph examination. The test dragged on for hours. When it concluded, the examiner reported no signs of deception. But damage, once inflicted, is not easily undone. For months, Denise would detect a subtle shift in the gaze of some officers, no longer solely a grieving mother, but someone whose innocence required perpetual reaffirmation. Meanwhile, Sergeant Creighton pursued every tangible thread. He requested lists of all vehicles matching the witness description registered within a 200-kilometer radius. He alerted U.S. Border Patrols to watch for any child fitting Jeffrey's description. The responses were dishearteningly routine. No matches, no sightings. By early May, the official search efforts were scaled down. Volunteers returned to their jobs, students to their classrooms. The Dupres home, once a beacon of family life, became a somber landmark, the house where the boy had vanished.
A few sympathetic neighbors brought meals, but conversations were strained, hesitant. Some avoided eye contact, unsure of what to say. For Denise, days blurred into nights. She left the curtains open, a constant vigil, hoping for headlights to finally stop outside. Sometimes in the half-light of dawn, she imagined the faint rattle of tricycle wheels. It was always just the wind. When the RCMP issued its first formal statement 3 weeks after the disappearance, it was chillingly brief. The investigation into the missing child, Jeffrey Dupres, age 3, remains open. All leads are being pursued. No mention of abduction, no suspects named. To outsiders, it sounded professional. To Denise, it sounded like silence.
The case file swelled, thick with statements, maps, aerial photographs, and lists of vehicles. Each document represented countless hours of effort and a lifetime of agonizing wait. The officers who had been there from the beginning began to rotate out, assigned to new cases. A fresh detective would arrive, pore over the file, and shake their head at the sparsity of leads. Within a few months, Slave Lake had settled back into its routines. School reopened, the forest fires were contained, and Jeffrey's name faded from public conversation. Yet, in the police archives, one thin folder remained on the shelf, simply labeled "Missing." And beneath that word, a question lingered, a raw wound no one in Slave Lake could answer. How does a child vanish from a street filled with eyes and leave behind not a trace? By the summer of 1981, Slave Lake had settled into a new, subdued rhythm. The search posters, once ubiquitous, now clung to poles and windows, their edges curled, colors faded to a ghostly whisper of pinks and grays. Jeffrey's name still stirred a pang of memory, but like the lake itself, that memory had grown still, its surface unbroken. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police officially kept the case open, but activity had dwindled to a crawl. No new witnesses, no fresh leads. Every few months an officer would visit the Dupres home, a procedural check-in more than a spark of hope. Files were updated with the disheartening refrain, "No significant development." For Denise McKee, each visit was a quiet reminder that her son's name now existed primarily in reports and dusty newspaper archives. Ray Dupres had returned to work in High Prairie. The house, once alive with a child's laughter, was now a realm of muted sounds. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of floorboards as Denise moved through the rooms at night. Jeffrey's small shoes remained by the front door, meticulously dusted, perfectly aligned, as if awaiting their owner. It was not denial, but a quiet act of defiance, a discipline to make the unmanageable absence bearable. In 1983, a fleeting tremor of hope. A family traveling through British Columbia reported seeing a boy who resembled Jeffrey. The description was compelling enough for RCMP officers in Vancouver to investigate. The child, however, was merely the son of a local couple, the resemblance a cruel coincidence. Such false alarms became tragically common, each one tearing open wounds that had never truly healed. By 1985, the national press had turned its gaze to other narratives. A decade of missing children cases across North America had flooded the public consciousness with countless names and faces. Jeffrey's photo occasionally resurfaced in missing persons roundups, but his case, like so many others, had gone cold. Then, in 1986, a new investigator, Tom Ridley, inherited the file. Ridley was known for his methodical approach, for seeing old cases as intricate puzzles rather than lost causes. He devoured every statement, every sketch, every map. After weeks of intense analysis, he confided in a reporter from the Edmonton Journal. He had a gut feeling that Jeffrey might still be alive. It was intuition, not evidence, but it was the first flicker of belief the case had seen in years. Ridley proposed comparing Jeffrey's file with the newly established National Missing Children database. The results were inconclusive. No matches, no cross-linked incidents. Denise followed the story from home, clipping the article and carefully folding it into Jeffrey's baby album, the one filled with Polaroids from before 1980, birthdays, his first haircut, a trip to the lakeshore. The pages carried the faint scent of old paper and detergent. She looked at them sometimes, a tangible reminder that her son had been real, a child who existed beyond the cold, stark word, missing. In 1988, the Dupres family relocated to Edmonton. Ray's health had begun to falter, his heart weakened by years of relentless travel and stress. The move was intended as a new beginning, yet Denise noticed how often he would drive back to Slave Lake, parking near the old house without ever going inside. He spoke little of these solitary pilgrimages. In 1990, at the age of 50, Ray died suddenly of a heart attack. On his desk, police later found an envelope addressed to RCMP Slave Lake. Inside was a single, poignant note. "If Jeffrey is alive, please tell him I never stopped looking." That same year, RCMP headquarters made the difficult decision to archive the Dupres file under inactive cases. It was not closed. In Canada, a missing child file never officially closes, but it was removed from the active rotation, joining hundreds of others in a steel cabinet, its label typed in fading ink. For Denise, time no longer flowed in years, but in anniversaries. Each April 24th, a small white candle flickered in her kitchen window. Some nights she imagined she heard her son's voice, a trick of memory woven with the wind through the trees. She had no photographs newer than 1980, no image of what he might look like as a teenager. In her mind, he remained forever 3, laughing, eyes wide, calling her name across the yard. The 1990s brought a few fleeting whispers. A man in Manitoba claimed to have seen a young adult with Jeffrey's features working at a roadside diner. A caller from the United States sent a letter hinting at a link to a child trafficking ring. None of it led anywhere. Each time, DNA testing or witness verification extinguished the hope as quickly as it ignited. By the turn of the millennium, technology began to reshape the landscape of cold cases. DNA databases, digital records, and online archives offered new avenues for investigations once deemed unsolvable. Jeffrey's file was scanned into a national system in 2000. A new, age-progressed photograph, digitally generated, depicted what he might look like at 23. Denise stared at the image on her screen, a long, silent moment. The eyes were familiar. The jawline subtly altered. She printed it anyway, placing it beside the original photo on her wall. In 2010, when devastating wildfires swept through parts of Slave Lake, Denise feared for the physical archives. The RCMP assured her that digital copies were safe. She thanked them, but maintained her personal binder at home. Every clipping, letter, and note since 1980, a private archive of unwavering persistence. By then, she had become a quiet oracle for others. Families of missing children sought her out, asking how she endured. Her answer was always the same: "You keep a door open, even if no one ever walks through it." In 2015, Denise ventured onto social media, creating a Facebook page titled "What Happened to Jeffrey Dupres." She uploaded the old photographs, the police sketch, and a concise account of the day he vanished. The page quickly garnered followers from across Canada, strangers who shared her posts, people who swore they had never forgotten the story. For the first time in decades, the case found a second life online. This quiet resurgence brought new messages, some genuinely kind, others claiming psychic visions or privileged information. Denise meticulously read them all,
replying only to those that seemed grounded in fact. She had learned to filter hope through the crucible of reason. Through all those long years, one question remained precisely where it began. What became of a boy who rode his tricycle across a yard and was gone before his mother turned her head? The case had transcended tragedy. It had become a stark measure of life's profound fragility. Beneath the tranquil surface of small towns and safe neighborhoods, uncertainty always waited, silent, patient, never aging. And in the archives of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, in a folder marked Dupres, Jeffrey, missing, Slave Lake 1980, the silence continued to grow thicker with each passing year. By the early 2000s, most people in Slave Lake no longer spoke Jeffrey's name aloud. A new generation had grown up, knowing the story only through faded headlines or the hushed tones of adults describing what had once happened on Burwood Drive. But for Denise McKee, the years had not erased the image of that red tricycle, nor the memory of a door left half open. Now in her 50s, living quietly in Edmonton, the binder of documents remained by her bed. The police had not contacted her in a long time, yet she called them every spring, a quiet ritual to ensure Jeffrey's file was still listed as active. The year 2000 brought a subtle shift that felt monumental. Canada's national database for missing persons was finally digitized. For the first time, cases like Jeffrey's could be searched by DNA, by physical description, by regional matches. Denise submitted a fresh sample to the RCMP, though she understood the odds were long. If they find someone who doesn't know who he is, she told the clerk, her voice steady, I want him to have a name. The clerk nodded, searching for adequate words. In 2003, a brief surge of hope. A Canadian consulate worker in Washington state reported a young man with features similar to Jeffrey's found living without identification. Cooperative but disoriented about his early life, RCMP officers flew south, collected DNA, and compared it to the sample on file. The result returned negative. For Denise, the disappointment was sharp but mercifully brief. She had learned not to build castles on rumors. Throughout that decade, forensic technology advanced far faster than local police budgets. Departments prioritized new crimes, and cold cases rarely received funding. Still, every few years, an officer would review the Dupres file. Margin notes hinted at quiet persistence. Check with U.S. National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, one wrote in 2007. Another added, possible link to Oregon 1980 abduction, negative ID. Nothing led anywhere solid. In 2010, Slave Lake endured another catastrophe, the Great Fire, which consumed much of the town. Entire neighborhoods were flattened, and the recreation hall, once the bustling search headquarters, was destroyed. When Denise saw the news footage, she worried the archives might have burned, but the RCMP confirmed that digital backups existed. It was a small relief, tinged with grief for a place that had already lost so much. The fire also rekindled local memory. Reporters covering the disaster asked older residents about the town's history. More than one mentioned the missing boy, the one from 1980. New articles appeared, brief but respectful, once again featuring Jeffrey's picture. For Denise, seeing that photo in print after 30 years was both comfort and pain. She cut one out and taped it to her kitchen wall. Underneath, in blue ink, she wrote a simple date, still waiting. By 2015, social media had become the new frontier for missing persons advocacy. Denise, encouraged by a friend's daughter, decided to create a Facebook page.
She named it What Happened to Jeffrey Dupres. She uploaded the old photographs, scanned newspaper clippings, and posted a brief but poignant account of the day he vanished. The story reached beyond Canada almost overnight. Volunteers from across the country shared it on local forums. Comments poured in, some offering sympathy, others sharing similar experiences, and a few claiming to have seen someone resembling the age-progressed images of Jeffrey. One private message caught her attention. It was from a woman in Oregon who remembered a family from Alberta living next door to her in the early 1980s with a little boy who didn't seem related to them. The woman recalled the boy's quiet demeanor and how he sometimes asked questions about a red bike. Denise forwarded the message to the RCMP. Investigators followed up, interviewing the witness and tracing the family's records. The boy in question had tragically died in an accident in 1990. DNA confirmed he was not Jeffrey. It was another dead end, but the process awakened something long dormant, the sense that people still cared enough to look. In 2018, an independent group of volunteers specializing in long-term disappearances contacted Denise. They offered to analyze the case using geographic profiling, a method of studying crime locations to predict offender behavior. Working with public records and old maps, they determined that the most probable escape route used by the kidnappers would have been Highway 2, heading south toward Edmonton. It was the same conclusion Sergeant Creighton had scrawled in pencil on his 1980 field map. After nearly 40 years, the lines had circled back to the same road. Denise found that detail oddly comforting. "At least the truth hasn't changed," she told a journalist. "It means someone, somewhere, took him on that highway. If we can find where the road ended, maybe we'll find him." By 2020, she had become an unofficial advocate for long-term missing cases. She was invited to speak at a national symposium in Calgary. Standing before a room of officers and volunteers, she spoke plainly. "A cold case isn't cold. It's just waiting for someone new to touch it." The hall fell silent for a moment before applause erupted. But it was in 2022, 42 years after the disappearance, that the case truly stirred again. Denise, now 68, decided to take matters into her own hands. She launched a GoFundMe campaign to hire a private investigator and commission a new age progression sketch of Jeffrey. This time not by computer software, but by a forensic artist with decades of experience reconstructing adult faces from childhood photographs. She set the goal at $20,000. Within weeks, donors from across Canada had met it. The artist she chose was Tim Whitten, a British forensic specialist renowned for his precise, lifelike renderings. Working from Jeffrey's early photos and family traits, Whitten created an image of a man in his mid-40s. Steady eyes, short brown hair, a faint scar on the chin. The same tiny mark that once defined a toddler's smile. When Denise saw the completed portrait, she said quietly, "That looks like someone I could meet on the street and recognize." The image was released nationwide in December 2022. Posters were printed with the stark title, "Missing Since 1980. Help Us Find Jeffrey Dupres, Age 45. A tip line was established, and a $5,000 reward offered for verified information. Television stations picked up the story during the holiday season. The case, dormant for decades, was alive again. Across Canada, volunteers distributed flyers in malls, libraries, and airports. Online, the new sketch was shared thousands of times. Some viewers commented on resemblances to acquaintances. Others simply wrote, "We remember." It was not proof, but it was movement. The slow, deliberate kind of movement that sometimes precedes discovery. Denise told a reporter that winter, "People think I'm holding on to the past, but to me, he's not the past. He's still out there somewhere in time, waiting for me to catch up." In a country that had grown accustomed to statistics, her persistence reminded others that behind each missing person file lay a single, enduring story, one that refused to fade quietly into the archives.
As snow fell over Slave Lake once again, the old question returned with the same clarity it had in 1980. Where did the road from Burwood Drive truly lead? The winter of 2022 brought both a renewed clarity and a deep fatigue to Denise McKay. The public's sudden, intense interest in Jeffrey's case meant a torrent of new interviews, messages, and rampant speculation, all of which she endeavored to manage with practiced patience. Reporters clamored to film her reactions. Strangers sent letters brimming with theories or heartfelt sympathy. She accepted each with polite grace, but gently reminded them that for her, this was not history. It remained an open wound, raw and without a clean edge. The RCMP, acknowledging the burgeoning public attention, agreed to review the file once more. A new generation of investigators took charge, led by Inspector Hannah Cole, who herself had been a child when Jeffrey vanished. Cole meticulously reopened the archived material, now preserved on microfilm and scanned into digital systems. Her team cross-referenced every report, every license registration, every interview recorded in 1980. They approached the file not with nostalgia, but as a complex logistical problem: 2 adults in a pickup truck, 1 small boy, a quick departure from town, and 42 years of profound silence. One of the first critical steps was revisiting the original witness statements. The primary witness, the woman who had described the light-colored truck, was located again, now in her 70s. Her memory, though dimmed by time, held steady on one crucial detail. The woman she saw leaning from the truck window had spoken softly, almost coaxingly, as if coaxing a pet, not shouting. It wasn't a shout, the witness recalled. More like she was saying, "Come here, honey." I thought she must have known him. This single sentence fundamentally reshaped the prevailing theory. Investigators began to wonder if the abductors had been strangers at all, or if Jeffrey might have trusted them, even for those fleeting seconds. The team then painstakingly examined vehicle records from 1978 to 1980, focusing specifically on custom-painted Chevrolet and GMC pickups registered within a 200-kilometer radius of Slave Lake. Hundreds of entries emerged, but one stood out: a truck registered to a man named Walter Kane, who had briefly lived in Slave Lake before moving east. Kane, then 31, matched the physical description provided by the witness: short, light-haired, clean-shaven. He had worked seasonal construction jobs and left town abruptly the same summer Jeffrey vanished. Records showed no further activity under his name after 1985. The lead was thin but tangible. Investigators followed it to Manitoba, where Kane's former employer vaguely remembered him traveling with a woman named Marie, younger than him, with brown hair and a quiet voice. They had rented a small house near Brandon for 6 months, then simply disappeared. No birth certificates, no tax records, no trace. The landlord remembered them, sometimes mentioning their boy, who was quiet and well-behaved. At the time, no one had asked questions. The RCMP contacted Manitoba authorities to check old school enrollment records from the 1980s. No boy listed as Dupres or Kane of a matching age was found, but the archives were incomplete, many lost to time. The lead faded into paperwork, but it carried the tantalizing scent of possibility that Jeffrey had lived, at least for some years, under another name. In February 2023, the independent investigator hired through Denise's fundraising campaign traveled to Manitoba to retrace that line. He interviewed locals, meticulously searched property deeds, and spoke with a retired mail carrier who remembered the couple vaguely. They were quiet, the kid was polite. They left one night, no goodbye. The private report noted that if the boy had survived, he might now be living under a completely different identity, completely unaware of his origins. The idea gave Denise a fragile kind of hope. Not proof of loss, not proof of life, but proof of possibility. Meanwhile, the new forensic portrait continued to circulate online. Among the thousands who saw it, one man from British Columbia wrote to the police, claiming he recognized the face, not as someone missing, but as a customer who had visited his small mechanic shop years earlier. "The scar under the chin," he wrote, "and the way he smiled looked just like that picture." Investigators checked the man's records. The customer had paid cash, left no forwarding address, and used the name Jeff K. The shop owner remembered that he drove a gray pickup, an older model, possibly a late 70s. It was another eerie circle back to the same vehicle that had haunted the file for decades. The RCMP tracked the tip as far as they could, but again, the trail dissolved into absence. No camera footage existed from that year, no receipts survived. Yet the cluster of small coincidences, the truck, the scar, the name, added weight to the theory that Jeffrey could have lived beyond the first day of his disappearance. Inspector Cole remained cautiously optimistic. In a press statement, she stated, "The evidence is circumstantial, but the consistency of these details cannot be ignored. Our objective is not to confirm belief, but to verify facts." It was the tone of a professional acutely aware that hope can mislead as easily as it can sustain. By late 2023, the investigation had reached a kind of suspended motion. Every plausible lead had been meticulously pursued, yet none could close the circle. The DNA databases offered no match, though technology was now capable of identifying relatives through genetic genealogy, a method that had solved several cold cases across North America. Plans were underway to apply it to Jeffrey's file, pending approval from his extended family. Denise followed every update with the composure of someone long practiced in endurance. She no longer imagined reunion scenes. She imagined paperwork, signatures, verifications, the slow grinding mechanics of truth. When asked by a reporter what she would say if her son were alive, she paused for a long time before answering. "I'd tell him I understand, that none of this was his fault, and that he doesn't have to come back, but I hope he knows who he is." In early 2024, a documentary crew from Edmonton visited Slave Lake to film a segment for a national series on unsolved disappearances. They stood near the old neighborhood, now rebuilt, interviewing residents who still remembered the search. One elderly man pointed down the road and said quietly, "That's where the tricycle was." The camera panned across the pavement, smooth and unmarked after years of repair. Nothing remained of the original scene, yet the air seemed to hold its echo. The episode aired that spring. Afterward, the RCMP tip line received several new calls, most vague, one claiming that a man fitting Jeffrey's adult description was living under another name in Ontario. Investigators followed up, but the lead stalled when the man refused DNA testing. Without consent, the case could not proceed.
The renewed search, despite its dead ends, achieved something different. It reminded an entire country that the case was not forgotten. Jeffrey Dupres was no longer just a photograph from 1980. He had become a symbol of persistence in the face of silence. For Denise, that was enough to keep going. "They can't say it's impossible anymore," she told her friend that December. "They can only say it hasn't happened yet." And somewhere in the intricate network of highways that once carry a pickup truck out of Slave Lake, the same question still traveled, quiet, persistent, older now but unquenched. If Jeffrey Dupres survived that day, does he still remember who he was when the road began? By the dawn of 2024, the case file labeled Dupres, Jeffrey, missing since April 24, 1980, had ascended to become one of Alberta's longest-running active investigations. Inside the archive, nearly half a century of paper and data lay layered together, handwritten notes from the initial frantic search, photographs yellowed by time, crisp new digital reports generated from recent tip lines. Each document marked a generation of officers who had striven to fit a complete story into a space that steadfastly refused to close. Inspector Hannah Cole's team pivoted their focus to what could still be measured. They requested access to the National Genealogical Database, a system that harnessed voluntary DNA samples from the public to trace genetic relatives, a tool that had been instrumental in solving several long-cold identifications across North America. To proceed, however, the police required the family's explicit consent and specific legal authorization, as Canada's privacy laws guarded genetic data as deeply personal. Denise agreed without a moment's hesitation. "If the truth exists," she told them, her voice steady, "I want it to find its way home." The DNA process was arduous, stretching over months. Samples from Denise and Jeffrey's surviving relatives were meticulously coded and entered into the system. Analysts embarked on a painstaking search for partial matches, not direct identification, but subtle connections through shared ancestry. The initial results were disheartening. Distant relatives in Quebec, an old match in France, none close enough to indicate a living connection. Still, the algorithms ceaselessly scanned, comparing new submissions each week. Meanwhile, the RCMP diligently reviewed the circumstantial trail left by the elusive couple known as Walter and Marie Keane. Records confirmed they had crossed provincial borders multiple times throughout the 1980s, yet had never been formally charged with any crime. In 1989, a car registered in Walter's name was impounded in Saskatchewan after a minor collision. No children were listed among the passengers. By the early 1990s, both names vanished from federal records, replaced only by gaping silences. No deaths, no tax filings, no further licenses. Whether they had changed identities, immigrated, or simply evaporated remained an unsettling mystery. Forensic analysis of old materials continued in parallel. The original photograph of the tire marks near the Dupres home, once deemed too faint for comparison, was digitally enhanced using modern imaging techniques. Investigators harbored a faint hope of matching the tread pattern with surviving vehicle models from the late 1970s. The result was only partly useful. It confirmed that the vehicle was likely a Chevrolet short-box pickup, model years 1978 to 1980, consistent with the earliest witness report. It was confirmation, not revelation, a stark reminder that the earliest facts of the case had been accurate all along. The inquiry now faced a different kind of challenge. After 44 years, the boundary between solid evidence and fragile memory had blurred. Witnesses were elderly, their recollections layered with the influence of retelling. A few adamantly insisted they still remember hearing the truck that day, its engine loud against the quiet street. Others admitted they might have confused it with the insistent whir of firefighting helicopters that had hovered over the town that same week. The more the past was revisited, the more it reshaped itself. In May 2024, one of the genealogical analysts contacted Inspector Cole with a note marked, "Possible second-degree relation." A DNA sample from a man in Ontario, uploaded to a public database, shared several genetic markers with the Dupres line. The match was not exact, but close enough to warrant urgent inquiry. The man, identified as Jeffrey K., age 47, was a construction foreman who had been adopted as a child. When approached by officers, he agreed to speak but appeared bewildered by the sudden attention. His adoptive records listed his birth in 1977 in Manitoba, but no official birth certificate was found. Cole's team requested a voluntary DNA test to clarify the relation. The man hesitated, citing privacy concerns for his family. After legal consultation, he agreed on condition of strict confidentiality.
The analysis took weeks. When the result arrived, it showed a 93% probability of kinship, consistent with being a first cousin once removed. Strong, but not conclusive proof that he was the missing child. The investigators informed Denise cautiously. She listened in silence, then said, "That sounds like the edge of something real." Further checks revealed that the man's early life before adoption was poorly documented. Hospital records from Manitoba in the late 1970s were incomplete. Several files had been lost in a fire decades earlier. There was, however, one surviving note in the provincial archive. An unnamed male child admitted to a local clinic in 1981, approximately 3 years old, brought in by a woman identified only as Marie. The child had minor injuries and was released after treatment. No follow-up information existed. The date and age fit. The discovery reignited debate among the investigators. Could the Marie in the hospital record be the same woman seen in Slave Lake? Could Jeffrey have lived under a new identity for a time before being placed for adoption? Or was this yet another coincidence built on fragile numbers and lost paper? Legally, the threshold for declaring a definitive match required absolute confirmation, either DNA from the missing person himself or direct parental linkage beyond any doubt. Without that, the case remained open. Still, the lead marked the first credible connection in decades, enough to shift the file from inactive pending back to active review. When the news reached Denise, she did not interpret it as closure. Sitting by her kitchen window, she told a visiting journalist, "Maybe he's out there, maybe he's not. But at least now, when I look out, I know which direction to face." In June, the RCMP held a small press briefing. Inspector Coles spoke briefly, choosing her words with meticulous care. "We have developed promising genetic leads. Verification will take time, and we will proceed with respect for all individuals involved. After 44 years, this investigation remains about truth, not blame." Reporters pressed, asking if she believed Jeffrey was alive. She paused before replying, "The evidence does not exclude that possibility." For a case long decided by silence, those words were as close to light as procedure would allow. In the months that followed, the RCMP continued quiet negotiations with the man in Ontario. The outcome of the DNA verification has not been made public. Confidentiality agreements prevent disclosure until all parties consent. Whether he is Jeffrey Dupres or merely a distant relative remains a question held in delicate balance between scientific possibility and personal consent. For Denise, now nearing 70, the uncertainty has become familiar ground. She keeps the new forensic portrait framed beside the old childhood photo. On quiet evenings, she looks at both, not to compare, but to acknowledge the profound expanse of years between them. Years that took everything, yet left her core belief intact. "A name can disappear," she once said, "but the truth has a long memory. If the final proof arrives, it will come not as a sudden revelation, but as confirmation, a slow, deliberate arrival of fact through the intricate corridors of law and genetics. And if it never arrives, the story will still have served its purpose, to show how persistence, even without ultimate resolution, can become its own profound form of justice. For now, the file remains open. The red tricycle, carefully preserved by neighbors and later returned to Denise, rests in a local museum exhibit on unsolved cases. The plaque beneath it reads simply, "Jeffrey Dupres, age 3, missing from Slave Lake, Alberta, April 24, 1980. Investigation ongoing." Some visitors pause to read. Others move on. But every few weeks, someone leaves a small toy at the base of the display. A silent sign, perhaps, that the question first asked 44 years ago still waits for an answer. By the winter of 2025, the investigation into the disappearance of Jeffrey Dupres had entered its 45th year. It was no longer merely a police matter. It had woven itself into Canada's collective memory, a potent symbol of what time, even at its most relentless, cannot erase. The town of Slave Lake, rebuilt and modernized, bore little resemblance to the quiet settlement of 1980. Yet in its library, at the back of a glass cabinet, the same photograph remained. A 3-year-old boy with a red tricycle and a half smile, his eyes bright under the sun. Beneath the picture, a single, haunting line: "Still missing." For Denise McKay, now 70, life had settled into a steady rhythm of waiting and remembering. She still resided in her small house near Edmonton, surrounded by a tide of letters from strangers who had followed the case online. Many addressed her as Mama Denise, though they had never met. Each spring she answered as many as she could, her fingers tired but her spirit resolute, thanking people for keeping her son's name alive. She often said the letters reminded her that the search had never truly been hers alone. Her world had narrowed in scale but deepened in meaning. She spent mornings tending to a small garden behind the house, afternoons volunteering for an organization that supported families of missing persons. Sometimes young parents would approach her for advice, their faces etched with worry for their own children in a world that felt increasingly less safe. She always offered the same counsel: be careful, but don't live in fear. Fear takes more than loss ever will.
The RCMP's Cold Case Unit continued to monitor the genetic lead in Ontario. Officially, the investigation remained open. Unofficially, many officers involved harbored a quiet conviction that some measure of truth had already surfaced, that Jeffrey had lived, at least for a time, under another name. Whether the man now in his late 40s would ever choose to confirm that identity remained uncertain, and the law fiercely protected his right to privacy. Inspector Hannah Cole, now nearing retirement, reflected that the Dupres file had fundamentally altered the way her team approached every missing child case. "You don't assume time closes a story," she explained. "It only changes the way you read it." Once a year, on April 24th, the town of Slave Lake held a small remembrance walk along Burwood Drive. Children from the local school carried candles. Parents stood quietly beside them. Denise attended when her health allowed, though she rarely spoke publicly. Last year, she stood near the place where her yard once ended and gazed down the street. Pavement now covered the old gravel, and new houses lined the road. The hum of engines had replaced the profound silence that had once followed her son's disappearance. For a long moment she stood there, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if listening for something carried back by the wind. Before leaving, she placed a small toy tricycle at the base of the memorial tree and whispered, "If you're out there, you've come far enough. Rest." For those who study such cases, the disappearance of Jeffrey Dupres remained an enduring open question, part forensic puzzle, part profound moral reminder. It demonstrated how justice can sometimes take the shape of relentless persistence rather than definitive punishment, how a mother's endurance can outlast systems, evidence, and certainty itself. Even without a concrete resolution, the case altered procedures, inspired databases, and built networks that have since reunited other families. In that quiet, practical way, Jeffrey's absence changed what Canada expected of its own guardians. Today, when visitors pause at the museum in Slave Lake, they often see the red tricycle first. Small, its paint faded yet intact. Beside it lies Denise's handwritten note: "I still believe someone will remember." The exhibit is silent, save for the faint hum of air conditioning. Yet, for those who pause long enough, there is something else, a palpable presence that belongs neither to the past nor to closure, but to the steady courage of those who refuse to let time dictate the end of their story. And so, The case of Jeffrey Dupres remains exactly where it began: a quiet street, a moment of trust, and a single enduring question that traverses every generation that stops to read his name. If this story moved you, take a moment, before you leave, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next case we reopen, and share this video if you believe every missing name deserves to be remembered. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching?